Have you ever paused in a quiet moment and imagined what it might feel like to confront life or death choices daily, measuring every breath against the beat of war raging all around you? Picture yourself on a scorched battlefield, the air tinged with dust and distant gunfire, each footstep winding deeper into unknown territory, the closeness of danger pressing against your rib cage. And yet, in your hands, you hold the power to change fate with a single pull of the trigger. That was the world Lyudmila Pavlichenko inhabited, a realm where survival and duty blurred, and the boundaries of courage stretched almost beyond comprehension. Today we're stepping into her reality, retracing the footsteps of the woman who came to be called Lady Death. It's a title that immediately invites fascination, perhaps even a shiver of awe. But behind that formidable nickname was a human being filled with complex emotions, personal struggles, and dreams that extended beyond the front lines. Born on July 12, 1916, in Belaya Tsurkov, now part of modern-day Ukraine, she arrived in a world already buzzing with revolution. Russia had turned a page in 1917, overthrowing centuries of imperial rule. A new identity was being forged under the Soviet Union's banner, one that demanded discipline, shared sacrifice, and unyielding commitment. For a child like Lyudmila, these shifting sands form the backdrop of her upbringing. Though details of her early years are often overshadowed by later feats, one can imagine the daily fabric of life in the new Soviet society: communal values, the steady hum of state-driven ideals, youth organizations encouraging physical fitness, civic duty, and readiness to defend the motherland. Before guns became her professional tool, Lyudmila was a passionate, energetic adolescent. She loved sports, and her quick reflexes in athletic competitions hinted at an instinct that would later prove invaluable. In her teenage years, she joined a paramilitary sporting organization, something many Soviet youths did, where she first honed her sharpshooting abilities. It was the 1930s, and the Soviet government put tremendous effort into ensuring its citizens were prepared for potential conflicts. The memory of World War I was still painfully fresh for many, and looming threats from neighboring powers spurred intense military preparedness. For Lyudmila, target practice quickly became a passion. She wasn't just decent at it, she was extraordinary. Her skill improved with startling speed, catching the eye of mentors who realized they had someone special in their ranks. What is often overlooked is that Lyudmila was also an ambitious student. She yearned for a more peaceful path, dreaming of pursuing a career in history. While some might find it ironic that the world's deadliest female sniper was also a lover of historical scholarship, there's a resonant harmony in that. History demands keen observation and a precise recall of past events, skills not entirely unlike those needed by a sniper who studies the terrain, notes the slightest movements, and calibrates her aim with an unwavering eye. She enrolled at Kyiv University, often spelled Kiev in older historical texts, around 1937, pursuing her interest in history. Outside of class, her continued involvement in shooting clubs became a crucial intersection of passion and duty. Friends have recalled how she carried herself with a quiet confidence, humble but undeniably certain of her abilities. She had an aptitude for focusing deeply on the task at hand, whether memorizing historical timelines or lining up the perfect shot at the range. Still, at that point in her life, no one could have guessed the great stage on which her talents would one day unfold. She seemed destined for the library and the archive, not for bunkers and battlefields. All of that changed in 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a colossal military invasion of the Soviet Union that turned the illusions of peace into a sudden, brutal storm. Like so many of her compatriots, Lyudmila's life trajectory was altered in an instant. The entire Soviet state mobilized for war, and with Hitler's forces pushing deeply into Soviet territory, the call to arms was impossible to ignore. When she volunteered for the Red Army, it wasn't entirely shocking to those who knew her. She was known for her patriotic zeal, a trait strongly encouraged from early childhood in the Soviet Union. But it wasn't just about patriotism. There was also a personal resolve in Lyudmila's decision. She wanted to defend her home, and she firmly believed that everyone with the skills to fight should do so. However, the Soviet military establishment, especially at the start of the war, did not immediately welcome women into frontline combat roles. Sniper units, though, were a small exception, and that is where Lyudmila finally found her opportunity to serve. From the moment she arrived at the battlefront, her commander and fellow soldiers began to realize they had a phenomenon on their hands. In the besieged city of Odessa, she quickly earned a reputation. Day after day, her kills mounted, sometimes multiple, in a single day. The frenzied nature of the Eastern Front cannot be overstated. These were among the largest and most brutal battles in human history. The Soviets were desperately attempting to hold strategic points against the ferocious onslaught of the German-led forces. Casualties soared, resources were stretched thin, and morale wavered. Amid that chaos, Lyudmila stood steadfast, her rifle a calm extension of her body. One rarely mentioned anecdote from her time in Odessa involves a scouting mission she undertook in the early morning mist. Reports indicate she crawled through debris and barbed wire to get within range of a highly skilled German sniper who had been terrorizing Soviet troops for days. The sun had barely risen when she located him. Through her scope, she watched him patiently scanning the horizon for targets, entirely unaware of her presence. It was a contest of nerves. She kept her breathing shallow, waited, and finally squeezed the trigger. The single shot was precise, lethal. This victory had a profound effect. Not only did it remove a major threat, but it also boosted the morale of her entire unit. Soldiers whispered about her calmness under fire, a quality that felt almost supernatural in the chaos of war. After Odessa, she was transferred to the defense of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, a siege that would become one of the most harrowing and emblematic of the entire Eastern Front. The city, surrounded on three sides by the Black Sea, was a critical stronghold the Soviets were desperate to maintain. Lyudmila joined other snipers, as well as infantry and artillery units, in a desperate bid to hold the line. It was at Sevastopol that her legend truly began to take shape. Day after grueling day, the bombs fell, and the German forces inched closer. Yet each dawn brought new opportunities for Lyudmila to thin their ranks with unwavering precision. The personal cost was enormous. She sustained multiple injuries, the scars of war biting into her flesh. Still, she returned to the front whenever her wounds allowed, driven by a fierce determination that eclipsed pain. Friends from her unit noted that her composure was often an anchor for others. She would crack a wry smile at jokes, help clean rifles, and methodically share tips on controlling one's breathing. One lesser-known story from Sevastopol claims that after a close friend in her sniper group was killed in action, Lyudmila sequestered herself in an abandoned bunker for hours, grieving silently. Then she emerged with a calm but steeled expression, found her position in the rubble, and proceeded to pick off several key enemy targets. Accounts vary on the exact number. Some say 5, some say more. But the emotional context was clear. Behind each bullet was a sorrow that only hardened her resolve. By mid-1942, her battlefield tally soared, and Soviet authorities saw in Lyudmila Pavlichenko an opportunity for something beyond the battlefield. Here was a young, attractive, and undeniably courageous sniper with confirmed kills exceeding 300, a figure astonishing in any context, but particularly so for a woman at that time. Official records credit her with 309 kills, a milestone that made her the most successful female sniper in recorded history. Propagandists recognized the potential of her story, a Soviet woman humbling the vaunted German war machine. She was nicknamed Lady Death, and that moniker spread far and wide, capturing imaginations in a nation hungry for uplifting heroes. The Soviet High Command decided to pull her off the front lines. She was no longer just a soldier, but a living symbol of Soviet fortitude. Exhausted and still recovering from her injuries, she was sent first to Moscow, receiving commendations and invitations to speak to the press. As she stood there, dwarfed by the colossal architecture of the capital, cameras flashed and reporters jostled for quotes. The quiet, focused sniper found herself thrust into the spotlight. Soldiers typically carried exhaustion and trauma in their eyes, and she was no different. But her presence ignited something in people, a shared sense of defiance and national pride. Then came an extraordinary twist. Lyudmila was sent on a goodwill tour to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, intended to rally support for the Allies. The year was 1942, and the Soviet Union was desperately urging its allies to open a second front against Nazi Germany. The story of Lady Death was tailor-made for this mission. Arriving in the United States, she became the first Soviet citizen received at the White House by a sitting president. Franklin D. Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt greeted her, their mutual curiosity bridging the gaps in language and culture. The press coverage of her visit was both sensational and at times patronizing. She was only 25, fresh from the brutal Eastern Front, and found herself fielding questions about lipstick, fashions, and her feminine side from American reporters who seemed incapable of processing that a woman could be such a skilled killer. Frustrated by the trivial question, she famously retorted at one point, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascists. Now, do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" It was a sharp, unforgettable moment that cut through the banalities, reminding everyone that this was not a sideshow performance. She was a soldier fighting for her life and her homeland. Not every American observer knew how to respond to her. Some admired her fiercely, thrilled by her determination and her fiery address. Others were unsettled by the entire notion of a woman as a lethal sniper. But in the political context, she served as a potent figure urging Western audiences to support the Soviet war effort more robustly. Beyond that, there was a human story that endeared her to those who got to know her personally. Eleanor Roosevelt was reportedly touched by Lyudmila's calm intelligence and sense of gravity. She recognized that behind the glamorous headlines was a woman bearing the scars of relentless combat and the weight of countless lost comrades. Eventually, Lyudmila traveled to Canada and Great Britain, continuing her tour. She spoke to large crowds, often generating applause and curiosity in equal measure. The Soviets, for their part, leveraged her public image back home, celebrating her as a model female soldier who exemplified the indomitable Soviet spirit. Meanwhile, historians today often examine this period with an awareness of how propaganda shaped her image. Was she truly the unstoppable force Lady Death, or was she also a psychologically wounded veteran placed in a highly public, politically charged role? The answer is, of course, both. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was a real soldier with extraordinary achievements, but she was also utilized strategically by a government that recognized the propaganda value of her story. If you delve into diaries and interviews conducted in the decades after the war, you'll find glimpses of her private struggles. She occasionally mentioned bouts of depression and nightmares that haunted her. Imagine living through the constant thunder of artillery, the screams of the injured, then being abruptly placed on a stage in front of thousands who cheer your lethal skill as if it were an entertaining anecdote. The whiplash of that transition must have been immense. Still, she carried on, aware that her presence could shift public opinion, perhaps drawing more resources or opening a second front that might ease the suffering back home. When she returned to the Soviet Union, Lyudmila was assigned a more advisory and training role. Her days of crawling through rubble and hiding behind the crosshairs were largely over, partly due to lingering injuries and partly because the government deemed her too valuable as a national heroine. She helped train new snipers, many of them women, passing on her hard-earned expertise. Stories from her trainees highlight her patience and remarkable eye for detail. She emphasized not just the mechanics of shooting, but also the mental fortitude required. "A single shot can be heavier than 100, she would say, implying that every time you pull the trigger, you carry the weight of that action indefinitely. In her personal life, details get murky. Some biographers mention that she was married during or shortly after her service, though the marriage did not last long. Others speak of a deep friendship turned romance on the front lines that ended tragically when her comrade was killed in action. The official records are sparse, but the emotional undertow is palpable. For Lyudmila, love was often overshadowed by the war's demands, and in the vacuum that followed victory in 1945, she was left to grapple with the ghosts of the battlefield and the complexities of being a living legend in a society reconstructing itself from the rubble. Outside of the Soviet Union, her tours in the United States, Canada, and Britain left a nuanced impression. While some audiences were left speechless by the thought of a woman playing the grim role of a sniper, others were inspired by her conviction, seeing in her a reflection of their own struggles against fascism. Her story, though, remained lesser known in the West for decades, overshadowed by the broader narratives of World War II. It wasn't until much later that English-language historians began showcasing her life as a testament to the complexities of women's roles in wartime. Over the years, she withdrew from public life. After the war, she completed her education and resumed her interest in history to some degree. But it's said she never fully escaped the weight of what she had experienced. Like many veterans, she struggled with the shift back to civilian routines. Occasional interviews or appearances cast her as the celebrated sniper, but rarely was there an acknowledgement of the emotional scars she bore. Perhaps the Soviet narrative preferred to keep her in the unblemished realm of war hero. Perhaps she herself wished to keep certain memories locked away. In 1957, she had a poignant reunion with Eleanor Roosevelt, who visited the Soviet Union. They toured Moscow together, a powerful image of two women whose lives had intersected at a pivotal moment in history. They spoke about the war, the future, and the changes that had swept their respective nations. Eleanor Roosevelt later wrote about being deeply moved by the resilience she saw in her old acquaintance, recognizing the cost that war heroes often pay once the applause fades. As the decades rolled on, Lyudmila continued to be honored in the Soviet Union. Monuments, tributes, and countless stories abounded, ensuring that her heroic feats would endure. But time marches on for even the greatest heroes. She passed away on October 10, 1974, at the age of 58, due to complications from a long illness. It's often said that she died quietly, far removed from the clamor of battle or the roar of cheering crowds. The official obituaries praised her as a stalwart defender of the motherland, a revered sniper who had more confirmed kills than any other female soldier in history. In Russia and across the former Soviet territories, her name remains a lodestar of patriotic valor. Meanwhile, her story has taken on almost mythic qualities in modern popular culture. Movies, documentaries, and YouTube features now attempt to capture the essence of who she was. One rarely discussed piece of her story revolves around an old friend from university who recalled meeting her by chance in the late 1940s. This friend had known Lyudmila before the war, and the woman she encountered after was unmistakably changed, more withdrawn, with an underlying tension behind her polite smiles. She still spoke fondly of books and historical figures, but there was a rawness in her eyes. The friend later wrote in a private letter that she had never met someone whose presence so clearly conveyed grief and pride in the same breath. Although it's just a single recollection, it reveals something of the complexity she wrestled with as she navigated post-war life. When it comes to controversies, some modern historians criticize how the Soviet regime glamorized her, using her story to overshadow equally deserving but lesser-known heroes, or to push a particular narrative about women's roles in the socialist state. Others assert that her recognized achievements are indeed legitimate, and that celebrating her efforts is fully justified. Another debate revolves around the moral weight of celebrating any lethal skill, even in war. Supporters argue that in the face of a brutal fascist invasion, her sniper expertise was a critical contribution that saved countless Soviet lives. Critics question whether hero worship of any soldier risks oversimplifying war's complexity. In the end, these discussions add depth to her legacy rather than diminishing it. Looking at the historical significance, it's crucial to see Lyudmila Pavlichenko not just as a curiosity or a footnote about the deadliest female sniper, but as a window into the scale and intensity of the Eastern Front in World War II. The Red Army's willingness to deploy women in combat roles speaks volumes about the existential threat the Soviet Union felt. Lyudmila's success also underscores how swiftly individuals were thrust from civilian life into the crucible of modern warfare. Her story illuminates broader themes: the resilience of human beings under pressure, the complicated interplay of personal agency and state propaganda, and the enduring hope that someday we might look back at such stories as cautionary tales rather than glorifications of violence. Across time, her legacy has rippled through culture in various ways. In 2015, the film Battle for Sevastopol dramatized her experiences, mixing cinematic flair with real historical events. It introduced her to a new generation, many of whom marveled at the fact that a young history student could become one of the most feared snipers in any theater of war. In YouTube videos, interviews, and documentaries, her life is dissected, mythologized, and sometimes misunderstood. But through it all, one central truth remains: Lyudmila Pavlichenko was far from ordinary. Regardless of how numbers are debated or stories are embellished, her unwavering focus and nerve on the battlefield have secured her place in history. To step into her shoes for even a moment is to confront moral and physical challenges few of us can imagine. It's to understand that sometimes, in a time of all-out war, a person's strongest virtues are twisted into instruments of violence out of pure necessity. And it's to wrestle with how those experiences linger long after the war ends. That's the tapestry of Lyudmila's life, a weave of duty, love of homeland, personal sacrifice, and a haunting memory of every target she lined up in her scope. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.